My aunt walked me down the aisle. Not my father, not my mother. My aunt, who drove 4 hours from Sudbury in a snowstorm, who showed up at my hotel room at 7 in the morning, with a Tim Hortons coffee and a tissue already in her hand, who said, "You look like your grandmother," and she was the most stubborn woman I ever loved. That was the sentence that kept me from falling apart. My parents were 40 minutes away. They had been 40 minutes away for 3 days. Let me back up. I grew up in a small city in northern Ontario, the kind of place where everyone knows your last name and your parents' last name and your grandparents' last name before they even know yours. My brother and I were 2 years apart. He was the younger one, the one who played hockey, the one who got the brand new equipment every season, while I wore hand-me-down skates to figure skating practice until I quit figure skating at 11 because I couldn't keep up with girls whose parents actually registered them for lessons. I never said anything about that. You learn early not to. My parents weren't cruel, I want to be clear about that. They fed us, they kept the house warm, they showed up to things, some things. The problem was never that they were bad people. The problem was that everything my brother did was slightly more important than everything I did. His hockey game was a conflict when it landed on the same weekend as my school science fair. His prom photos took 2 hours and mine took 20 minutes because we had to get back. When I got into university, actually got in, with a partial scholarship from the school, my dad said, "Good, we'd always knew you were smart," and that was it. No dinner out, no phone call to the grandparents. When my brother got his apprenticeship 2 years later, my parents threw him a party in the backyard with a sheet cake from the grocery store, and my uncle drove up from Barrie. I don't tell you these things to make you hate my parents. I tell you because context is everything, because the story I'm about to tell you doesn't make sense unless you understand that by the time I was 26 and living in a one-bedroom apartment in Hamilton and sending my parents $250 a month, I had already spent 2 decades telling myself it wasn't that bad. The $250 started when I got my first real job out of school. My dad had been laid off from the mill and my mum was working part-time at the pharmacy. And they called me one evening and said they were a little short, and could I help out just for a few months? I said yes. 3 years later, I was still sending it. I never brought it up. I didn't know how. I was carrying about $38,000 in student debt at that point, and I had never once mentioned that to them, and they had never once asked. Meanwhile, my brother bought a house in the same city as my parents with his girlfriend, now his wife, and they had a housewarming in September. My parents drove over 3 times that weekend. They helped paint the living room. My mom made her cabbage rolls. My dad built a shelf in the garage. I heard all of this through the group chat, which included photos, which included my parents grinning in matching paint-splattered shirts like it was the best weekend of their lives. My wedding was the following April. Kyle and I had been together for 6 years. We got engaged the previous Christmas, and I called my parents from my kitchen and told them. And my mom said, "Oh, that's lovely, honey." And my dad said, "He's a good guy." And then my mom asked if my brother had heard the news yet. That was the call. We picked a venue in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I know, not exactly a budget choice, but it was the one thing I had wanted since I was little, the stone buildings and the gardens. And Kyle and I had saved for 2 years specifically for it. My parents were in Timmins, which is roughly a 4.5-hour drive. Long, yes. Not impossible. We gave them 11 months' notice. We offered to book them a hotel room. We offered to pay for the hotel room. My mom said they'd figure it out. 6 weeks before the wedding, she called and said they didn't think they could make the drive. My dad's back was acting up. It was a lot of hours in the car. I said, "There's a direct bus from Timmins to Barrie, and then Kyle's cousin can pick you up. We already looked into it." She said, "We'll see." 3 weeks before the wedding, my brother texted me, not called, texted, to say that my parents had decided it was too much for them and they were going to celebrate with us when we got back. I stared at that message for about 10 minutes. I did not respond. I went to the kitchen, I stood at the sink, I cried for a while. Then I called my aunt. My aunt said, "I'll be there, and I'll make sure you're okay." The wedding was on a Saturday in late April. Kyle's dad walked with me. My aunt sat in the front row where my parents' names were on the reserved cards, and next to her were two empty chairs. We had ordered a boutonniere for my dad and a corsage for my mum, and they sat on those chairs the whole ceremony in the little plastic boxes they came in, and I don't think anyone in that room didn't notice them. The photos exist. I have never looked at them. I didn't hear from my parents that day. I texted them a photo from the venue, the two of us in the garden, Kyle in his grey suit, me in the dress I had altered twice, and my mom responded with a heart emoji. My dad didn't respond until the following Tuesday. Kyle and I left for our honeymoon. We did a week in Nova Scotia because we'd always talked about driving the Cabot Trail, and we finally had a reason to commit to it. It was genuinely one of the best weeks of my life. We ate lobster rolls in parking lots and hiked in the fog and didn't talk about my family once. When we got home, I put the wedding cards in a box, unpacked my suitcase, and went back to work. About 3 weeks after we got back, I got a call from my dad. Not a text, a call on a Wednesday afternoon from a number I still had saved as Dad Home. He said he was going to be in Hamilton for a few days. My cousin had moved there recently, and he was helping with some yard work, and he wanted to meet for coffee. I said fine. He came to the cafe near my office. He was wearing his good jacket, which I noticed because he almost never wore his good jacket. He gave me a hug that lasted longer than usual. He looked tired. We sat down. He ordered a black coffee. I ordered nothing. And then he pushed a manila envelope across the table and said, "There's some things we need to sort out about your grandmother's estate." My grandmother, my dad's mother, had passed away 2 years prior. She had lived in the same house in Kapuskasing for 40 years. I had visited her every summer as a kid. She taught me to make pie crust and to play cribbage, and told me once that I had better sense than anyone else in the family, and that I should never let anyone convince me otherwise. She was one of my favourite people. I had not known there was an estate to speak of. I opened the envelope. Inside were several pages, legal documents photocopied, a will, my grandmother's will, dated about 8 months before she died. I started reading. My grandmother had owned the house outright. She had also had a savings account, an RRSP, and a small investment account, none of which I had ever known about because nobody had ever mentioned them. The total, according to the documents, was somewhere around $217,000. In the will, she had divided her assets between her 3 children. My dad and his 2 siblings, each of them received their third. But my grandmother had also added a clause. She had specified that a portion of my father's inheritance, $50,000, was to be held in trust for me, to be given to me upon my marriage, or my 30th birthday, whichever came first. I had gotten married 6 weeks ago. I looked up at my dad. He was looking at the table. I said, "Why are you only telling me this now?" He said the lawyer had sent the documents after the funeral, and he had meant to bring it up, but things got busy. And then time passed, and, his words, "We weren't sure you'd still need it." I put the papers back in the envelope. I held the envelope in both hands for a moment. I said, "Dad, I have been sending you $250 a month for 3 years. He said he knew. I said I have $38,000 in student debt. He said he hadn't known that part. I said you didn't come to my wedding. He didn't say anything. I left the cafe with the envelope. I walked back to my office. I sat at my desk for 40 minutes and did not do any work. Then I called Kyle, and then I called a lawyer, a real one, not the family one who had handled my grandmother's estate, and I made an appointment for the following week. Here is what I learned. The $50,000 had been sitting in an account that my father had signing authority over, with my name listed as the beneficiary. He was legally obligated to release it to me. The fact that he had not done so immediately after my grandmother's death was, at minimum, a breach of his fiduciary duty. The lawyer used that phrase, breach of fiduciary duty. I also learned that the trust had been accruing interest since my grandmother died. Not much, but some. About 19 months of interest on $50,000 in a basic savings account. It came to a little over $3,000 on top of the principal. The lawyer sent a formal letter to my dad, certified mail. He received it on a Thursday. That Saturday, my mum called me crying. She said my dad hadn't meant any harm. He had just been overwhelmed after Grandma died, and the timing was hard, and they had needed the interest from the account to help cover some expenses. And did I really need to involve a lawyer? Was this really what family did to each other? I sat on my couch and I listened to her cry for about 4 minutes. And then I said, very calmly, Mom, you couldn't drive 4.5 hours to my wedding, but you expected me to send you money every month. And you sat on $50,000 that belonged to me for almost 2 years. I'm not angry. I'm just done pretending this is normal. She didn't say anything, I said. The lawyer will handle the transfer. You don't have to call me again about this. The money came through in full about 3 weeks later, including the interest. 53,000 and some change. I need to tell you what I did with it, because this is the part that matters to me. First, I paid off my student loans. All $38,000. I went online, I transferred the money, and I sat there and I watched the balance go to zero, and I cried. Not sad crying, the other kind, the kind that surprises you. Kyle made dinner that night, and we ate at the kitchen table and didn't talk much, and it was one of the quietest, most peaceful evenings I can remember. Second, we put a down payment on a house. A real one, not a condo. A house with a backyard in a neighbourhood in Hamilton, where I can walk to the farmer's market on Saturdays. We closed in the fall. Third, and this is the part I hadn't planned, but that felt right. I set up a small bursary through the university where I went to school. It's not a lot, $1,000 a year, for a first-generation student from Northern Ontario. It's not enough to change everything, but it's something. It's for someone like me who got in on her own and had to figure the rest out by herself. I cancelled the monthly transfer to my parents the same week the money came through. I sent one text to let them know. My dad responded with okay. My mom didn't respond at all. My aunt came to visit us in December. After we moved into the house, she brought wine and a plant, and she walked through every room and said it looked like us, which was the best compliment she could have given. We sat in the kitchen for 3 hours and talked. At some point she said, "Your grandmother would have been furious that it took this long to get to you." I said, "I know." She said, "She always knew, you know, that you were the one who'd be fine no matter what." I think that's why she wanted to make sure you had it. I've thought about that a lot since. The idea that being capable, being the one who figures things out, who doesn't ask for help, who just keeps going, can become a reason to expect less of you. You're fine so you don't need the school registration fees. You're fine so you can send money home. You're fine so we don't need to drive 4.5 hours. But here's the thing about being fine. It doesn't mean you didn't need anything. It just means you learned to go without. My grandmother's ring came with the estate documents. A small sapphire, yellow gold, nothing fancy. It was listed in the personal effects section, with my name next to it. My dad hadn't mentioned that either. I wear it on my right hand. I wore it for the first time on the day we got the keys to the house, which felt right. Kyle noticed it and asked where it was from. I told him. He held my hand for a minute without saying anything. I don't know what happens with my parents now. I don't hate them. I think they made choices, over and over again, that came from their own limitations and their own blind spots. And I was the child who was easy to shortchange because I never made enough noise about it. I think they probably didn't realize how much they had asked of me, or if they did, they found ways not to look directly at it. But I am 31 years old. I live in a house I own. I have no debt. I have a husband who drove to Sudbury in February to thank my aunt for walking me down the aisle. I have a ring from a woman who saw me clearly. I stopped waiting to be chosen a long time ago. I just didn't know until this year that I could also stop paying for the privilege of being overlooked.